Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Law and Sustainability webinar from the Peking University School of Transnational Law, the first such webinar for the new academic year. You're all very welcome. My name is Stephen Minas. I'm a member of the faculty at STL, and it's really a privilege today to be able to welcome Dr. Jiang Hao to present to us. Let me first of all start by apologizing for the technical difficulties last week, which prevented us from beginning at our scheduled time, but thank you very much for bearing with us and joining us today. So Dr. Jiang will be presenting on the topic of regulatory challenges of renewable energy integration in China, past, present, and future. Dr. Jiang is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's also directing their LLM program in energy and environmental law, and indeed is an associate editor for the journal Climate Law, and doing, I think it's very fair to say, some very interesting research in terms of Chinese renewable energy law, but also Chinese carbon markets and emissions trading. So Hao, you're very welcome to take the floor, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for the very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share some of my research with all of you. So first of all, please allow me to share my screen. And I hope that you can see my screen properly. So my presentation today will be about the regulatory challenges of renewable energy integration in China. So in terms of the agenda, I'm going to briefly talk about the role of renewable energy in the context of China's carbon neutrality target. And essentially, it's about the important role of renewable energy. I'm pretty sure everybody has already known that. And then I'm going to briefly touch upon the supporting mechanisms in China's renewable energy law because of the time limit. So my presentation is going to focus on a very particular supporting mechanism, which is about priority access and also full purchase of electricity from renewable energy sources in China. It is more about the specific regulatory arrangements which have been adopted by some of the very important regulators in China, for example, the National Development and Reform Commission, the National Energy Administration, etc. Again, because of the time limit, I couldn't really expand on those issues. Simply because the regulatory arrangements in China regarding renewable energy integration are still developing. I'm going to tell you, for example, what's been happening in the past and also what's been going on at the moment. And also I'm going to shed some light about what's likely going to happen in the future. And then finally, I'm going to touch upon, again, very briefly, the regulatory challenges and also my own reflection about what really has been going wrong in China to facilitate renewable energy integration. I'm pretty sure some of you have already known this. In September 2020, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced at the UN General Assembly that China is committed to achieving carbon neutrality before 2060. If you can just mute yourself, that would be wonderful because I can still hear some of the background noise. Despite the general welcome of China's pledge by the international community, some commentators raised the concern that the pledge at the moment is not supported by any specific plans from a legal and also regulatory point of view. The essential question is how the carbon neutrality target will be translated into legal obligations by the detailed breakdown of the climate targets in China, and to what extent the targets can steer dramatic changes of China's energy portfolio in the years to come. So when we look at the essential strategies in China towards carbon neutrality, essentially we're looking at 4 strategies, including decarbonizing power generation through ramping up energy, clean energy, which is renewables and nuclear. The second strategy is about electrification. Electrification of end use, for example, transport, industry, heating, and also cooling. The third strategy is about acceleration of fuel switch, which is essentially about cutting down coal consumption. And then finally, adopting carbon removal technologies such as carbon capture and storage, or offset through new forest growth. As the biggest energy producer and consumer, especially coal, China can only achieve the carbon neutrality target through structural changes to energy production and consumption, and more importantly, through phasing out fossil fuels. Currently, China's economy is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, which account for 85% of the energy mix in the country. As you can see from this table, China's power sector is a prime example of being fossil fuel intensive, in which coal-fired generation still accounts for 65% of the electricity supply and over 40% of China's CO2 emissions. Relative to other sectors, electricity provides greater opportunity for emission reduction in China in the short term and also the longer term due to the promotion of generation and increasing competitiveness of wind and solar power generation. And I have to mention that, again, as you can see from this table, for the moment, the share of wind and solar in China's power mix is still quite small comparing to coal-fired generation. So in order to promote renewable energy development in China, China adopted the Renewable Energy Law back in 2005, and the law was amended in 2009. Essentially, China's renewable energy law has largely followed the German model to have supporting mechanisms, including, for example, renewable energy target, and also a planning system at both the central and the provincial level, and also priority access of renewable energy to the network, and also the full purchase requirement of renewable energy, and a feed-in tariff mechanism, which is a subsidy provided to renewable energy generators, and also finally the cost sharing mechanism. The Renewable Energy Law of China expressly provisions that the cost in relation to feed-in tariff and also the reasonable cost arising from the physical connection between renewable energy generators and the grid network will be shared nationwide through a surcharge on the end users of electricity. So my presentation today essentially is about the regulatory arrangements in relation to priority access to the network, which is, I think, a very fundamental aspect of renewable energy integration in China, which I think is very different from other jurisdictions in terms of the challenges they are facing. So before I talk about that, let me just give you some very brief ideas about the electricity sector governance in China and also electricity sector regulation in China as well. Despite some differences in terms of the components of electricity market across different jurisdictions, in the case of China, we're essentially looking at 4 different components, as you can see from the graph here. First of all, for the electricity sector governance in China, the general features include decentralization as well as fragmentation of power. Decentralization here essentially means that the electricity sector in China is pretty much governed by provincial government, as well as some of the very important powerful state-owned enterprises, because of the demand for electricity generation to power industrial activities over the past years, and also through the process of reform, decentralization of decision-making is a very important aspect of electricity sector governance in China. In the meantime, when we look at China's electricity sector regulation, the market itself is still being heavily regulated, especially from the perspectives of electricity pricing. We're essentially looking at both the on-grid tariff and the retail price. So both the on-grid tariffs and the retail prices are still being regulated. That's kind of the overall situation. I'm pretty sure some of you know the recent reform in 2015, which is about deregulation of the pricing in China. But overall, the pricing regulation in China is still present at the moment. Another very important feature of regulated electricity market in China is about dispatch regulation or dispatch rules. So I'm going to touch upon briefly on that, essentially about the reform of the dispatch in the context of implementation of renewable energy law in China. The general feature of dispatch regulation in China, again, is a very general observation, is administrative dispatch, which is very different from a more liberalized energy market where dispatch is really based on the marginal cost of electricity production. So when it comes to renewable energy integration, first of all, we need to put in place the installation of renewable energy generators, and also to ensure the physical connection of that generators to the grid network in the country. This is where feed-in tariff plays a very important role, because it's a very important subsidy to incentivize renewable energy investments, because again, from a general point of view, renewable energy generation is much more expensive and also costly than conventional coal-fired power generation. So in the context of China, integration of renewable largely depends on the expansion of the grid network, which is more about the physical connection and also the level of subsidies, feed-in tariffs, as well as the dispatch rules. Again, in the context of China, we have seen that the higher feed-in tariff for renewable energy generation has really led to higher addition of renewable energy generation capacity in the country, which is pretty much shown in this graph here, because comparing to other countries, you can see very clearly that China has been really the pioneer in terms of installing renewable energy generation capacity, which is very different from consumption, because in the context of China, another very important issue is about curtailment. I'm pretty sure, again, like most of you have seen this either in the news or in the journal articles before. So curtailment here, in the case of China, mostly happens in the northern part of the country, where there's a concentration of wind and also solar renewable energy sources. As you can see from this graph here, in the northern part of China, most of the provinces have seen significant increase of wind capacity, of all the installed capacity in those provinces. But then in the meantime, the curtailment rate in those provinces are also really high. I'm going to give you some more specific numbers. As you can see from this graph here, some of the provinces have seen, for example, more than 30% of curtailment for wind power generation especially in 2015 and also 2016. So to give you some more specific ideas about the curtailment and integration challenges China has been facing, the average curtailment rate of wind power in the country back in 2016 is 17%. And then we've seen provinces, for example, Gansu, Xinjiang, and also Inner Mongolia, with really high curtailment rate. And very similarly, for solar power, the curtailment rate in those northern provinces were also really high back in 2017. Gansu and Xinjiang suffered really high curtailment rate with more than 30%. So putting this number in a more comparative context, in 2016 alone, the curtailment of wind power in China is actually higher than the total electricity consumption of the country like Bangladesh, with a total population of 163 million. As I mentioned earlier on, so my presentation today is about the regulatory arrangements underpinning renewable energy access to the network in China. We mentioned briefly about the general provision, which is Article 14 of Renewable Energy Law of the PRC. And then following that, some of the very important regulators, NDRC, SERC, have implemented more specific rules and regulations to support the implementation of that priority access rule. So I'm going to briefly mention about those regulatory arrangements. So essentially, this is what has already happened in the past. Although most of these regulations and also regulatory arrangements are still in force at the moment. So first of all, Article 14 of Renewable Energy Law has established the well-known priority access and also the full purchase provision for renewable energy generation in China. In addition, the article has also established some very important rules regarding the duties of relevant government authorities, responsibilities of the grid companies, and also the renewable energy generators. So let's quickly go through these aspects. For the relevant authorities, they are required to design specific implementation measures in relation to priority access and full purchase provision. The grid companies are required to enter into a power purchase agreement with renewable energy generators. So the power purchase agreement essentially will be the basis to determine how much electricity will be dispatched. For the responsibility of renewable energy generators, they have to cooperate with power grid companies to protect what is known as grid security as well as stability. So the term here will come up again in one of the very important documents issued by the ICRC in the following year, which I'm going to tell you in just a moment. So shortly after the promulgation of Renewable Energy Law, the NDRC issued a very important regulatory document known as the Regulations on the Management of Renewable Energy Generation. So this regulatory document contains some very important obligations, rules and obligations for grid companies. First of all, the grid enterprises are required to fulfill mandatory connection and also full purchase of renewable energy requirements by planning and building the physical connection in a timely manner to accommodate development of renewable energy. On top of that, the grid enterprises are also obliged to measure and collect statistics of electricity generated by renewable energy, which has been purchased, and also fulfilling the obligation to report information to relevant provincial and central regulatory authorities. But in practice, based on the NEA's discovery, the reporting obligations have been poorly implemented by the grid companies, and especially when it comes to dispute resolution. For example, a contract dispute arising from curtailment of renewable, the information regarding the electricity being purchased, as well as the circumstances affecting integration of renewable will be very important part of the evidence. But unfortunately, when it comes to practice, the renewable energy generators normally don't have that detailed information to support their argument because of the poor implementation of this reporting obligation. In 2007, the SERC, which is known as the State Electricity Regulatory Commission, issued another very important implementation measures to support the full purchase of electricity from renewable energy sources in China. Some of you may know that the SERC was already dissolved so many years ago, and its function and also staff have already been merged into the National Energy Administration. But this regulatory document here is also hugely important because the SERC took a step further, trying to clarify the circumstances which allow curtailment to take place. Essentially, it's about either it's a force majeure event or circumstances threatening grid security and stability. And also the SERC stated that the circumstances threatening grid security and stability, as mentioned, shall be defined by the Electricity Regulatory Authority in China. However, to date, we haven't seen any official definition and also clarification regarding those circumstances. So the consequences of this is that when it comes to the power purchase agreement, the grid companies will have a much higher and a stronger bargaining power because the interpretation regarding circumstances threatening grid security and stability basically is within the hands of those grid enterprises. So in addition to that, two important regulatory documents, one of the very essential efforts being made by the central regulatory authorities is about reform of the dispatch regulations and rules in the context of increasing renewable energy installation in China. As I mentioned earlier, the basic rules underpinning dispatch in China is administrative dispatch. So in the context of increasing renewable energy generation, and of course, following the rules to support priority access of renewable energy to the grid, the experimentation here is known as the energy efficiency dispatch or green dispatch, which aims to establish the dispatch sequence based on the level of energy efficiency of each generating unit and also the pollutants discharged. Again, subject to the requirement that such dispatch sequence does not pose any threat to the stable operation and reliability of the electricity system. So based on the new dispatch sequence arising from green dispatch, we can see that obviously renewable energy was prioritized. For non-dispatchable renewable energy, essentially those are the renewable energy generators which are not connected to the transmission network, which means that they can only be, the electricity can only be locally consumed. So those sort of generators were given like the highest priority, followed by dispatchable renewable energy. So that's really like the top tier for dispatch. And then after that, nuclear, which is known as a clean energy, will also be given priority dispatch. But then in practice, however, we've seen a very different story in terms of implementation of this dispatch sequence. The trial program of this green dispatch was initiated in 5 provinces, including Jiangsu, Henan, Sichuan, Guangdong, and Guizhou. However, the implementation of this green dispatch experimentation was heavily resisted by other provinces in the subsequent rollout of this experimentation nationwide. Although green dispatch was able to deliver some positive outcomes for energy efficiency improvement and cost savings, the benefits will prove to be very marginal. And also, the experimentation has also caused a lot of adverse effects in practice. So the NEA discovered that when it comes to implementation, provincial authorities really try to intervene the process of dispatch. Some of the very specific examples are shown here. For example, Hunan provincial government deliberately linked the electricity generation quota with purchasing of local coal. And also the Hubei provincial government interfered the sequence of green dispatch by prioritizing selected medium-sized coal-fired generation. There's very limited information regarding the ownership of those medium-sized generation, but based on my own research, so those medium-sized coal-fired generators, most of them are actually owned by provincial state-owned enterprises, while the larger units in the province are owned by some of the central SOEs. So the larger units obviously will have higher energy efficiency, and then based on the energy efficiency dispatch rules, those larger units will have to be given priority. But in practice, in the case of Hubei, obviously that's a very different story. And also the regulatory arrangements on green dispatch and deregulation of generation planning may also blur the operation of the dispatch rules, which aims to be more efficient. In the case of China, for example, in the north, during the winter months, central heating is a very important aspect to which also requires the sort of like the changes of dispatch sequence. So the issue here is actually about the combined heat and power generation units, which are primarily used in the north to provide central heating during the winter months. And then those power plants are in fact given priority dispatch to meet the heating demands of the general public, which has the consequence of curtailing renewable energy, and especially wind power in those provinces during the winter month. So realizing the adverse effects of this energy efficiency dispatch, the experimentation essentially was ended after a few years, and then provinces actually reverted back to administrative control of operation hours for generators, and also the administrative dispatch as well. So according to the regulatory documents adopted by the NDRC back in 2015 as part of the electricity sector reform measures in China. The dispatch rules nowadays in China are known as the tier dispatch, which is essentially a tier system to indicate a sequence of priority access to the grid by different types of generators. So according to the relevant rules, the top tier priority includes renewable energy generators, as well as coal-fired generators, which serve some certain purposes, and also combined heat and power units, which ensure heating supply, and also those units which have met the environmental requirements. Within each tier, provincial authorities are given discretion to decide the sequence of priority based on real conditions of the region and in accordance with the principles of ensuring grid security and stability, and taking into account issues such as cost and system flexibility. Although renewable energy is placed in the first tier for priority access, the tier system in practice legitimizes priority access by certain coal-fired generators and combined heat and power generation units. And obviously, this is like a step backwards from the very ambitious experimentation on energy efficiency dispatch. So from these various regulatory arrangements before, we can see that so far the dispatch rules and also the priority access for renewable energy in China have not really been properly managed or reformed. So because of the really high curtailment rate in 2016, the central government agencies in China have taken some further steps to address the issue of renewable energy curtailment. One obvious changes is the shift of focus to increase renewable energy consumption instead of capacity addition. And also we have seen a lot of administrative mandates requiring renewable energy integration in China instead of relying on further market reform. So I'm going to briefly touch upon some of those administrative mandates to give you some ideas about what's been happening actually at the moment. So the NDRC, first of all, realized the seriousness of renewable energy curtailment in the country and then issued these management measures for full and guaranteed purchase of renewable energy. In these regulatory documents, essentially the grid enterprises are required to purchase a certain amount of electricity from renewable energy generators. And obviously from the wording itself, you can tell this is like, again, a significant step backwards from the full purchase requirement by the grid enterprises based on the renewable energy law. And also the NDRC and NEA are given the authority to determine the annual target for the guaranteed amount of electricity purchased from renewable energy generators. And then in 2016, again, the NDRC issued another regulatory document, which is to clarify the legal consequences arising from non-compliance of not purchasing the guaranteed amount of electricity from renewable energy generation. The consequences are that provinces which fail to meet the minimum requirement for renewable energy integration will be banned from constructing new projects, including those which have been included in the national or provincial planning or have been granted permission for construction. And then more specifically, in the same year, 2016 and 2017, the NDRC and also the NEA have designed and implemented this investment monitoring and early warning mechanism for wind and solar. So this warning system has adopted a traffic light system to show the level of risks in provinces and regions deemed to have higher or lower curtailment rates in the previous year. So when a province or a region is labeled as red in the year when the evaluation results are published, the NDRC and also the NEA will not approve the provincial plan for wind or solar power development in the same year. And the provincial governments will have to temporarily postpone their approval for new investment. When the red color warning is issued, it is recommended that investors make very careful decisions to build renewable energy projects, because grid companies will no longer accept and handle new applications for grid connection. When the warning result is orange, the provincial governments will have to surrender very careful plans to ensure the priority access of renewable energy generators to the grid network. Otherwise, the NEA will not approve new investment in the same year. If the warning result is green, provincial governments and enterprises can basically make decisions regarding the renewable energy investment based on the market conditions. And we can see here that the administrative mandates are pretty much very well designed to ensure minimum purchase of renewable energy in China. And also we have seen some very quick and also temporary solutions to the curtailment issue in China, because the NEA has already acknowledged that those administrative mandates have been quite effective in terms of reducing the curtailment rate, because those mechanisms have really targeted provincial authorities and also enterprises to adopt technological and operational management measures to improve system regulation capabilities and to optimize priority access for renewable energy in the country. According to the NEA's assessment, the average renewable energy curtailment in China has been reduced significantly, and also the curtailment levels have been drastically reduced. For example, in the case of Xinjiang and Gansu, the rates have dropped from more than 30% to less than 10% in the year of 2018 as well as 2019. So based on information I presented to you just now, some of the very general reflections about regulatory challenges and prospect of renewable energy integration in China are that despite the reform efforts, especially on dispatch, the issue of renewable energy access to the network is still largely unresolved through a very systematic approach in China. So we've seen relying on sort of like the more market-oriented approach, for example, through the power purchase agreement etc. in the early days, and then gradually moving to more administrative mandates requiring minimum purchase of renewable energy in the country. So at the moment, obviously, the reason why the curtailment rate in China has been reduced is because of the implementation of those mandates instead of the market reform measures. So that's really one of the very general feature of what's been happening in China right now. So the key challenges here are really about the adjustment of benefits caused by those regulatory measures, which we looked at before, the implementation of the energy efficiency dispatch, as well as the tier dispatch. In the context of decentralized electricity sector governance in China, provincial governments essentially are in charge of managing that adjustment of benefits. But to date, we haven't seen very successful management by the provincial authorities regarding that adjustment of benefits. Some of you may know that one of the very important changes happening nowadays, which is also likely to affect the dispatch frequency in the future, is about the interprovincial trading. Because of the uneven distribution of renewable energy resources in China, interprovincial trading is a very essential aspect to allow increasing consumption of renewable energy in the country. That's really something I haven't been able to look into, but I think it's hugely important in the future. So most likely, we need to rely on more market-oriented approach to facilitate interprovincial trading, but that's not really happening at the moment. And also the reform of the electricity sector in China has also been very slow because of many reasons. For example, the resistance from the great enterprises, as well as the lack of cooperation from provincial authorities. And I hope my presentation is useful because I think I'm actually presenting to general audiences. So some of the information is actually quite brief and also general. I'm very happy to take any questions from you. Thank you very much for your attention. And also thank you once again, Stephen, for organizing this event. Back to you, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much, Hao. That was a terrific presentation, and I think the clearest presentation I've seen in the Chinese context of the distance between capacity and consumption and the challenges for an energy system which is rapidly changing in terms of its composition. So as Hao mentioned, the floor is open for questions. I should say here that we are recording this webinar. So if you're happy to be in the recording, you're welcome to raise your hand and ask a question. Otherwise, you're also welcome to write your question into the chat box. So the floor is open for any questions. Well, as I don't see any other questions, perhaps I could ask you how we've seen some very significant targets set for 2030 and 2060 in terms of China's carbon trajectory. We're also now in the process of the detailed planning under the new 5-year plan, and there's been some interesting reports of a renewable energy plan which is being developed. So do you foresee any changes to the regulatory framework in the near term to incorporate some of these new and more ambitious climate change targets?
Well, that is a very excellent question, Stephen. I think you also touch upon a very important issue here, which is about the increasing target for renewable energy consumption instead of installation. Because in the past, obviously the focus was really about promoting renewable energy installation. For the moment, I think one of the key issues, as I mentioned in my presentation, is about the effective regulatory tools which can be utilized to increase renewable energy consumption. So we've seen the targets, for example, in the near term, 2020, which is about 15% of renewable energy consumption. And then based on my observation, and I think that target was not ambitious at all as compared to the level of installed capacity of renewable energy in China. So putting that into the different words, essentially that target can be easily achieved. So the key question in the future is about more ambitious renewable energy consumption targets by 2030 as well as 2060. So for 2030, and I think the target can be more ambitious in the sense that we've seen grid parity, which means that the competitiveness of wind and solar comparing to coal-fired generation has been significantly increased. Some of you may know that the feed-in tariff for wind power has already been removed. And then most likely the feed-in tariff for solar power is going to be removed fairly soon, which means that I think the potential for renewable energy, like more renewable energy installation in China is great. But then the key challenge here, hopefully you can see from my presentation, is about integration. So essentially it's about dispatch, because we've also seen because of the post-COVID-19 economic recovery plans, more coal-fired power plants have been given green lights in China. So the competition between different types of generators will be even more fierce. Again, I think when it comes to achieving the target, it can be easily achieved through mandates, administrative mandates, as I've shown you just now. So the key challenge here is, and also the key question from my research is about to what extent that mandates will be sustainable in terms of facilitating a high level of penetration of renewable energy in China. I think for me, that is really questionable. I think eventually the whole system will have to rely on more market-oriented approach.
And just on that topic of moving towards a more market-oriented approach and the reaching of cost parity, price parity in different parts of the world, including China, do we foresee the use of auctions for capacity, competitive tendering? Is that a policy tool which is being used in China?
The short answer is yes. So we've seen provincial authorities using auction to actually enhance the competitiveness of renewable energy projects. We've seen that in the more recent years across provinces in China, which I think is also quite effective in terms of reducing the cost of renewable energy generation. But then the problem is, I think auction is still quite a small portion of the overall installation or capacity addition in China, because I think feed-in tariff, because before I think the level of feed-in tariff was still relatively higher than other jurisdictions in China. So that's really attracting a lot of investment for renewable energy installation in the country.
So once again, we are open for questions. I see a number of climate and energy experts in the audience. So let's just wait for a moment to see if there are any questions. So as we don't see any questions, let me ask you again how about something which I suppose you may not have had time to address in your presentation, but which you've looked at in one of the papers that you've written on this topic, which is the process for resolving disputes concerning the issues that you've raised. And you have a very interesting discussion of mediation and how mediation has been used in this space. So I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that for us.
Of course, Stephen. That's a very important issue, obviously, as you have mentioned. So one of the reasons why, because in the paper, I'm pretty sure the paper you read is about renewable energy integration in China, in which I talk about in detail the regulatory arrangements and also dispute resolution and remedies for renewable energy investors. So I did a relatively thorough search for relevant cases regarding the disputes between renewable energy generators and the grid companies. And I couldn't find like a lot of cases. And then I spoke to people about this. So one of the main reasons preventing renewable energy generators to bring relevant cases to court, first of all, is a prerequisite requirement for mediation, as you have just mentioned. But the mediation here we are talking about is administrative mediation. It's not really like the common mediation we know in practice, because according to, again, one of the regulatory documents issued by the NDRC, so NDRC will play very important roles in the administrative mediation to resolve any disputes arising from the power purchase agreement. Essentially, it's about curtailment, because before, if curtailment took place, the feed-in tariff was not going to be paid. So obviously, that will really, strongly affect the investment recovery for renewable energy investors. But because of that administrative mediation requirement, there's basically no information regarding how the disputes were actually resolved, because obviously the meeting was actually held behind closed doors, and then there's no publicity of that. And also another important reasons preventing renewable energy generators to bring relevant cases to court is because of the lack of official definition regarding circumstances threatening grid security and stability. Because in the contract, the power purchase agreement, the grid company will put into like a clause basically saying curtailment is allowed in the context of circumstances threatening grid security and stability. And based on the information I presented to you just now, obviously the interpretation of that clause is within the hands of grid enterprises. So that's really problematic in the sense that even if curtailment actually took place, renewable energy generators will not be able to sue the grid enterprises based on that particular power purchase agreement they enter into with the grid company. I think that issue has to be resolved. But to date, we haven't seen any official definition or clarification regarding the circumstances, which is clarified by the ICRC document.
So there's a really interesting question here, both about the interpretation of the key clause of power purchase agreements, but also about the ultimate ability to enforce these PPAs, which are presumably going to be more important as we move towards a more market-based system.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important issue. As I mentioned at the very beginning, before everybody entered the room, I mentioned about my very keen interest to do some interviews. And I think that's really something I'm very keen to unfold in terms of the implementation of the power purchase agreement in practice, and also the challenges arising from observing that essential rules. So I hope that will have a opportunity in the future to present my research discoveries.
Absolutely. And perhaps I should just pause once again to invite colleagues if they have any questions. If not, let me ask you then about how this topic of renewable energy regulation interacts with another area of expertise of yours, which is carbon trading. The launch of the national carbon market. How do you, or in fact, do you expect that to have an impact on some of the challenges that you've discussed? Or is that something which is not expected to have an immediate result here?
Well, that's a very difficult question to actually answer in the very short sentences. My general observation for the national ETS is that because it is essentially a market-based instrument and it has to rely on the pricing signal to play very important roles. And then in the context of China, because of the slow process of electricity market reform, and I haven't seen like the enabling environment for the carbon pricing to play important roles, which means that when it comes to, for example, divest of coal-fired generation and also the elimination of some of the inefficient coal-fired generators, the pricing mechanism or the role of the pricing mechanism is extremely limited. Which also means that in the near future, I think China's national ETS, although it sounds really kind of like pessimistic, is going to play very limited roles for the simple reason that the pricing signal is not going to play very important roles in the future or in the near term without liberalization of the market, electricity market in China.
Yeah, so I think that's very much a consensus view that without the ability for the cost of carbon to be reflected in the actual price of electricity, the market is not going to function in the way that it would if you had that flow through to the ultimate price. So as we're nearing the end of this presentation, I might just ask you if you have any final comments to offer to us, both about what you've discussed, but also what you foresee in this area of law and policy in the short to medium term.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And I think my presentation essentially really focused on the problems and challenges which I described in the context of renewable energy development in China. I think something I really want to say is that I think renewable energy will have to play a very important role in the future. And I think all those problems which I mentioned will have to be addressed as well. And I think, again, from my own observation and also research, and I think the central government is quite keen to address those issues. But the challenges right now I really like at the fundamental level is the governance issue, as I mentioned, because the sector itself is very much decentralized. And also the authority for example, new investment and also decision-making are also rather fragmented. And I guess one issue which I have also observed in the research is that the central government has been increasingly relying on more centralized regulatory tools. I think for those of you who are interested in this area, obviously we see a contradiction between centralization and decentralization. And I think for research, that's really something interesting to explore, to understand what are the potential complications and also implications arising from that different trajectory of centralization and also the general context of decentralization. So I'll be very keen to hear any thoughts in the future in our exchange and communication in the future. And I should mention that Stephen and I, we do share something in common. I think we both studied at Melbourne Law School at certain points. That's also where we met for the first time before, if I recall correctly.
Correct. Yes, it's perhaps more years ago than I care to remember now, but that building in Parkville is a building that we both passed through. And thank you very much, Hao, for this presentation and this discussion. I think it's really shedding light on a topic that, if we look at the global challenge of climate mitigation, could not be more important. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your further work in this field. And thank you, everybody, again for joining us today. I wish everybody a nice day wherever you are. Take care. See you later. Bye.
Bye.